podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to The Racket Report, the podcast that tries to take you inside the world of organized crime from a perspective that you very rarely heard. We've done a lot of interviews on this show, but I don't know that I've ever gotten the amount of feedback, the amount of interest, the amount of curiosity to any interview, as was the case a couple of weeks ago when I brought you Anthony Bingy Arilotta, former captain in the Genovese crime family and the author of the new book, End Syndicate, How I Took Over the Genovese Springfield Crew. If you didn't hear that discussion, it was an eye-opener. And it was unlike any discussion I've ever had on this program. So I do hope you'll go back and check it out. But there was only one problem. There was a limited amount of time, but I had an unlimited amount of questions. So Anthony Bingy Arilotta is kind enough to come back. Anthony, it's great to talk to you again. Thank you.
Hey, great to be here, Frank. Thanks for having me on again.
So, Anthony, whether people heard our previous conversation or not, you were a captain in the Genovese crime family, which is primarily a New York crime family. You, though, were operating in Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, to be specific. For people that might be curious, how is the mob in Massachusetts different than the mob in New York, if at all?
It's not different. It's just smaller amount of families in Western Mass, Connecticut, Central Mass, Worcester, a big territory, same tactics that are used. We still have bosses and soldiers and make the money all the same way. The good thing about being in Western Mass, Connecticut is there's less competition. So the only competition is with your own family, which makes it a lot easier to settle territorial disputes, who's with who, as far as on record with who making money, everybody. It's more controllable with less families. And, we get the lion's share of all the money because of that, so we don't have like 5 other families fighting over, every square inch of New York City like they got in New York and throughout the boroughs of New York. So we do have a big territory here.
Who would you report to on a regular basis? Who would you report to?
So over the years, Springfield has its own boss of the Genovese family. He's a boss, and he's a captain in the overall family of the Genovese family. But for local, he's a boss. So when they tell stories about him in the newspapers or when they indict him or, anything, it's, the reputed boss of the Springfield faction of the Genovese family. So we have bosses here, and the soldiers and associates would, the soldiers would report to the main guy, the associates would report to the soldiers would report to the captain, which is the boss of Springfield. The boss of Springfield, if there's something important to discuss, whether it's going to be a murder, something with another family gets involved, because we do have patriarchas in the New England area. So if a dispute ever arises, our boss here would go to New York and report to the bosses down in New York City, whether it's one boss or they're using a panel of 3, however they're conducting it in New York City. So Springfield would report directly to New York, only on matters that were serious matters. They'd always get together. When I was little, they used to always come up to my father's store, have meetings, just to, formalities, just to see what's going on and everything. But there was never no money that was sent down to New York City. It wasn't anything along those lines. What Springfield made, Springfield kept. I'm going back all the way up until 2003 when I became boss. There was always that was the permit, and everything ran smooth. There was never no problems. Every guy in this Western Mass, Connecticut were all multimillionaires. There was plenty of money. It was flourishing with rackets that you could make money with. And they really controlled it all the way up to when I took it, control of the entire Connecticut, Western Mass, and Central Mass, Worcester. And they controlled it with that. When I say legitimate businesses, legally, like with the politicians, they had, like the connections with the politicians and judges and DAs, all the rackets, the street rackets. And so the boss here would report to the boss in New York City of the Genovese family. And like I said, there was never any issues unless there was some internal beef. Someone had they're going to murder. They have to get the okay from the boss in the Genovese family in New York. A different boss takes over. The Genovese family in New York has to okay it. Who's going to be the replacement of the local, the Springfield boss? Things along those levels. And it ran smoothly. It ran smoothly from the 30s all the way up until 2010. Everything, 03 when I got there, that's when,
Got
everything changed as far as the tactics that they used in New York, as far as their schemes. But
Got it. Now, for people that didn't hear our previous conversation or may not be familiar with you, and I hope they'll check out your book, End Syndicate, How I Took Over the Genovese Springfield Crew, you ultimately made the decision to become a cooperator. In our last discussion, we talked about why you made that decision. But what was interesting is that you remained in Springfield. You are not in the witness security program or anything like that, right?
correct, yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of folks, you've described your role in participating in murders of rats, and a lot of folks that only know the mob from movies and books may think, well, wait a minute, how is this guy writing books and talking publicly about being, a cooperator, and then walking around without being in the witness security program? There's still a Genovese Springfield faction, and yet you're still in Springfield. How does that work, and are you ever fearful that they may seek some sort of retribution against you?
Yeah, so the Genovese faction of Springfield is pretty much wiped out. That got wiped out with when New York put Arthur Nigro to become acting, boss of our area of Springfield's faction, and had brought informants into the family that weren't made guys. And, fast forward 2010, I cooperate, I get out of the life. And like you said, yeah, I murdered guys that cooperated and informants. Back then, 2003, it was a totally different era in the mob circles. Today, Springfield doesn't exist as far as the Genovese faction anymore. There's nothing here. There's nothing here in Springfield as far as, the made guys that are here. I think there's a couple that are like, one's 100 years old and he's been inactive since he was in the 70s. This guy's been inactive. So he was non-existent his entire career up until like the 70s. And then the other guys, they're old too. They're in their 90s. And, when they came out of prison back in early 2000s, they pretty much were shelved. They didn't want anything to do with, especially this one guy, Frankie Pugliano. He didn't want anything to do with reporting to the new boss, Artie Nigro, and he was put on the shelf for that. So you got a couple of old timers. You had a couple of wannabes, but that's done and finished. The one guy that they write about, I mean, he's dying in the hospital. He's not going to make it. He's brain dead in the hospital, and that was supposed to be the new, what you call, guy that they were going to, he wanted to be in that position. But like I said, he's dying in the hospital. He hasn't, he's been in the hospital. He's, I don't want to get into why he's there and all that.
No, we don't. But he's not relevant. So the point, though, dying. Is you're not fearful.
And New York City, another thing is, so New York, the mob changed today, even in New York City, even though they all exist, the powerful bosses are still streets, but the tactics all changed. They're not engaging in street crimes like they used to, because street crimes pretty much don't exist like they used to. Everything is legal, and it's hard to make money on the streets with the old rackets that we used to make money with. And the other thing that they all figured out is there's no more murders. They're not killing anybody. And so with that being said, it's pretty much a different era. If it was back when I was around, I would say there's a pretty good chance that someone, would step up and maybe, attempt to do something. But today, especially now, 2024, yeah, it's over with. Even in New York City, I'm not saying the mob is dead in New York City. I'm just saying that their whole scheme of things is totally different. They don't operate the same way.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
Understood. One of the names that always comes up whenever you're talking about organized crime in Massachusetts and New England in general is James Whitey Bulger. I think most people listening to this are probably familiar with what became of Whitey. He led the one of the largest criminal organizations in New England for years. Turned out he was working with the FBI for a lot of that time. And then he went on the lam, very famously, was part of America's top 10 most wanted for a long time. And then ultimately he goes to prison, gets convicted, and he was ultimately killed in prison. What folks may not know is the name of the person that killed him. It was Freddie Gies, who I've heard you were actually pretty friendly with. What can you tell us about Freddie, and what did you make of his role in Whitey Bulger's killing?
So Freddie was in my crew. I met him in the 1991 while I was in state prison with his brother. He came up on a visit. I met him and his family, and they came up to visit their brother, and my family came up to visit me. So we met out in the visiting room. Then when I came home in 91, his brother and me had a lot of plans. We were young kids, wild, young, crazy, me and his brother. And, we were always in trouble in state prison. So, but we had talked, they weren't involved in organized crime circles. They were a crazy family. I got along good with them because we were similar. We were violent. The only thing is they weren't Italian. They were Greek. And I was more into the making money streetwise with organized crime rackets. And I was Italian. So we had that difference. But when I got out, and so I ended up getting out in 91, Freddie's brother was supposed to get out right after me. He ends up beating up an inmate, and that was the last straw. They shipped him to Walpole, dangerous prison. He ends up beating up a guard there. He ends up getting more time. So he ends up not getting out until 96. So in the meantime, in those 5 years, I started working with his brother, Freddie, and, just doing, he was working for his family's jewelry store. He wasn't involved in he was involved not in the streets like an organized crime criminal. He had a wife, kids, he worked, he was a prison guard prior to working, at his family's jewelry store. So he was along those lines, but he would make money on the streets, rob a drug dealer, rob credit card type things. We used to hijack trucks. So we ended up becoming close, growing up. We were both in our 20s. When I got out of prison, I think I was 22. And so for the next 5 years, we hustled. He ends up going to prison on and I think I explained it to you on the last interview, mm-hmm. They robbed a truck, him and this fellow named Gary Westerman, and they ended up getting a 4-year sentence. So he had to go back to prison from 97 to 2001. When he got out in 2001, you could tell he was, prison changes you, in ways. Some people get out, never want to go back. Some people, everyone wants to get out, but some people just like the camaraderie of being around guys. And he met a lot of, Boston, Massachusetts, have a lot of crazy Italian, Irish gangsters. And so he was around them. A lot of them had bodies, murders. And so he kind of, he liked being around that element. When he got out in 2001, that's when I was asserting power more in the local Genovese family in Springfield. I started becoming more, more assertive, being more established. So that's when him and his brother got out again. His brother went back for another 4-year sentence. That's when we end up, I put them with a lot of street rackets that I was involved with, like marijuana. 2003, I ended up formally getting inducted into the family, and those guys were more or less, I had a large crew, but I could depend on if we had to participate in murder. And you could tell, like, Freddie liked the fact of murder. He was around the guys when he was locked up those 4 years. They all had stories. Everyone knew they had bodies. He liked that aspect of it. So fast forward when he's locked up in, and he liked killing too, like he enjoyed the fact that we murdered somebody. He would want to, you never talk about it afterwards, but he would want to, he'd bring up things about it and, which, I would never do. I don't do. And so he just liked the fact that, we were killers and he wanted to keep killing, for any little infraction. There's people around my city that he was going to kill them. Even these guys are so-called friends of his to this day. They don't realize that he was going to kill them when we were on the street. And I was putting stops to it all. One particular guy's son disrespected Freddie's girlfriend, and this guy was a good friend of mine at the time. And Freddie wanted to kill his son. I stopped that. So he liked the fact of killing. So when Whitey comes into the prison, Whitey being known as an informant, it was a perfect opportunity to, take a guy out, especially a guy with that notoriety, and get notoriety out of it, become, notorious. And that's exactly what happened.
So when it comes to killing Whitey Bulger, did he do it because of a personal beef with Whitey Bulger or because Whitey particularly offended him for having been a rat? Or did he do it for what you just described? He just wanted notoriety for being the guy that killed Whitey Bulger.
Yeah, I believe he wanted the notoriety for killing Whitey Bulger. I mean, it's just like me. In that life, you're going to have enemies. I mean, just think of people that you participated in murder. They got family. You make enemies through your own whole life. It might not even be murder. It could be something on the street. It could have gave someone a beating. So when it came to personal, there was nothing personal there. There's stories that came out that Whitey framed this kid from the guy ended up doing 40 years for it, but those are people that are just trying to, like a theory of why he might have done it. The kid that he was with, Paul DiCongilero, he had history with Whitey too. But, to participate in that, in my take, was for the notoriety of killing him. I mean, from what everything came out in the thing, Freddie's the one that went in there and he didn't go in with a knife. He didn't go in. He didn't gouge his eyes out like they say. He didn't cut his tongue out like they say. He beat him with a lock and a sock. He wheeled him into the cell, beat him with a lock and a sock, and he beat him so bad, the guy bruised so badly that it looked like his eyes were cut out because of the swollenness, and his tongue, the way it was positioned like that because of the beating it to his head, the trauma to his head, it looked like that his tongue had been cut out and his eyes been gouged out. But that's all been confirmed that didn't happen. So it was the notoriety of, if you knew Freddie wanted to kill 25 people, and that wasn't for me. Like, I wouldn't mind killing any of my enemies. I'm all for that. Somebody that was trying to kill me, I'm all for that. But just to go on pick guys just to pick them out and say, yeah, let's kill him. That's what he wanted to do. You know, his motto was, what's the difference of killing one or killing 12? We're still going to get a life sentence. And so his whole thing was he wanted to be known as that guy because, you know, there was guys in Connecticut and Boston that were known for having 10 bodies, 5 bodies. And he wanted to be like one of those guys, because when you talked about those guys, everybody was like, you know, they always gave those guys, street guys that had the most bodies, more of street credit on the streets, and, you know, could get, you know, away with a lot more on the streets having bodies. Once they know you got bodies, pretty much, you know, no one's going to fuck with you. I mean, other guys with bodies, he's still going to get killed, but, you know, it just gives you that notorious image, and that's what he was about. And he took out Whitey, I believe, for the notoriety of it.
In terms of what you're doing now, you've written this book. Everybody's talking about this book. There's a lot of interest in your whole story and in the book specifically. Why are you choosing to tell your story now? What are you hoping people take from this? What are you hoping to get out of this? Where is this going, and why tell your story in the manner that you're telling it now?
So I'm telling the story. This is how it all started. In 2000, you always hear stories, and like, you know, you probably hear a lot of New York stories with your radio station and all that. You always hear New York, you know, Gotti, all the 5 families, books written on all of them. You hear about Boston, which is Eastern Mass, you know, like the Angelos, and Patriarcha, which is in Providence, big time notorious gangster. And you never, ever hear books and stories about Western Mass and the Connecticut faction going into Worcester. Worcester had a notorious mobster, Carlo Mastrotaro, and he was like an underboss for the Genovese family based out of Worcester. And, you know, you never hear any stories of the Worcester crew. You never hear any stories of Springfield, nor you know, the notorious bosses that we had. Big No Sam was, like I said in the last interview, he was at the Appalachian meeting when they all met in that 57 and they all got arrested. You know, they were all running. He was there. He was present with his soldiers at that meeting. You know, he was a legendary Don. He lasted from they don't know when he exactly got into power, but they said it was 1940 and he lasted till 1983. So he had a 43-year run. And this guy was legendary along the same likes as any boss in the country. You know, he had a run like an Tony Accardo in Chicago, or Carlo Gambino. You don't see bosses with that type of a run, 43-year run.
Wow,
and this guy was notorious. And all throughout Connecticut, there was notorious gangsters, Billy Grasso, Whitey Tropiano, the list goes on and on. So my story for telling the book was not to talk about my life story. My book was to get a writer to discuss the story of Western Mass and put the story of,
Gotcha.
You know, what it's like being in Western Mass, Connecticut. And I'm a part of the story, and I can talk about it. So I can help with the story. And the way the story ends up being written was, you know, my life in the mafia, which, like I said, my goal was to put Connecticut, Central Mass, Western Mass, and, you know, let them know. Because a lot of people, I talk to people today, they never knew, you know, like Springfield was the way it was. They're seeing the interviews now that I'm doing, and they had no idea, you know, going back to the 20s, how violent it was in the city all the way up until 2010 when I went away. You know, we were doing hits for the biggest family in New York, and we're from Springfield. We're going down and do hits, and that wasn't the only one they wanted. I stopped other ones from happening, you know, because we weren't going to get used for, like, you know, crash dummies, you know, always going down to New York to, you know, I went down to participate in a beating of another guy in New York. So it was like, you know, we're going down from Springfield, which is like a 2-hour drive to New York, to participate in murders and beatings. And so, you know, we were, I wanted to put us on the map as far as give a little note, you know, the recognition that I believe that it should have, you know, for this area. That was the whole reason of writing the book.
Got it. Makes sense now. Now you've,
but you know, it's so deep, you know, with my story, you know, you cannot, if I'm writing a book, unless it's going to be like 1,000 pages, it's hard to put all that in a book.
Right.
You know, it's just hard to incorporate it all.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I totally get that. And I think you've pulled that off with this book. Let me ask you again, though, about some of the very serious crimes that you've talked about, not only here, but in the book: murders, robbery, assault. Do you feel that you've fully taken accountability for the harm and the destruction caused by your actions during your time in the mafia? And how do you reconcile your past deeds with what you're doing now with your current life?
So the way I look at it is, you know, I like you say, come out and have remorse and feel sorry, right? I have remorse. I apologize to anybody out there that's perfect. You know, when you find me somebody that, you know, is a perfect human being, and to that person, I apologize to, and I have total, I wouldn't say remorse, but I apologize that. The problem is, in the world today, there's so much, never mind just mob shit. You know, if you go into politicians, dirty politicians, you go into this sex trade that's going on where they're molesting kids and they're all involved in that stuff. Then you got just people that are just bad human beings in general, just liars and, one of those, like gossipings and, human nature, you have. So for that, anybody that is perfect, I apologize to. When it comes to the families, I said this in the last interview, we kill each other. And, I feel somewhat remorse for the families that I participated in. Those families have to realize that their family member that was murdered participated in multiple murders and took away fathers from their families. Like my friend Antonio Facente was murdered. I grew up with them, and Al Bruno killed him. And so, that's the life he chose. That's the life I chose. And we're okay with, you just try not to be that guy that ends up getting murder.
Any regrets, Anthony, through the prism of hindsight? No.
Yeah, no. The regret I have is now. So that's a different question.
Right.
Okay. So when you ask me, how I felt about it, like I said, I'll apologize to anybody that's perfect out there. That anyone that can judge me that's perfect, I apologize to you. But make sure you're perfect. So, but if I have regrets, and I've said this in numerous interviews, I'm not a cold-hearted, just murderous. I was involved in the mafia at a time where if you got an order, you had to do it. If I didn't do it, I would be killed. So that's number one. That doesn't exist no more today. So, so that's what we know about. I know since a little kid growing up Italian and family being around it, that one day I might have to kill. And they always said, you're going to have to kill someone. It's always somebody that's very close to you, maybe even your best friend, which I pled guilty to conspiracy and my best friend. So as far as regrets now, I regret all the violence. That's what I do regret. If I could go back and live my life and go back to when the murders happened, right, I would change it all right there. And I wouldn't participate in any of the murders. In fact, I wouldn't even join the mafia. I didn't need to join the mafia. I was a multimillionaire prior to getting made. I was 33 years old when I got made, and I was a multimillionaire. I had a family. I had legitimate businesses all over the Connecticut and Massachusetts. I didn't need to join the mafia. So my regret would be participating in the violence. If I could go back, I would, I would have never. Well, when I say not joining the mafia, if I don't join the mafia, I pretty much, I don't want to say for sure I don't murder, but
right.
I pretty much don't get orders to murder.
Right. One follows the other. That's what I
agree.
Got it.
Yeah. I mean, I regret, that. And, like when you say like the one particular murder with Al Bruno, I don't want to kill him. I explained that to you on the last interview. It wasn't my motive why he got killed. It had nothing to do with me why he got killed. I pled guilty to conspiracy to murder him. I had no choice because at the end, the soldier that got given the order by the boss in New York wasn't capable of killing him. So I ended up getting called to New York and had to participate in that murder. And I didn't want to do that. I was close with Bruno. I don't want to participate in that order. But, once I got ordered by the boss, it's kill or be killed. There was no way of going and warning him. And let me just switch it around a little bit. If Bruno got the order to kill me, be sure that I would be a dead man. For sure.
Oh, no.
So, that's just that. And, that's just our life.
Yeah. I understand that. Now, I believe every word that you've written in this book. I think it's all 100% accurate and an incredible history of your time running the Springfield Crew. But I have seen a lot of cooperators over the years make up stuff in their testimony, make up stuff in their books in order to get a better book deal or in order to make themselves into a big shot. So a lot of people listening to this have had the same experience that I've had and that you've had, where you've seen people like John A. Light and others just make things up that completely aren't true. Given your past as a mobster and your decision to cooperate, why should people trust your account of events in this book? How can readers be sure that your version of the story is truthful and not self-serving?
Well, I think I discussed a lot of, if you look at the testimony in New York during the trials and compare it with, the actual facts of what was written in the book, they're going to be spot on. And I guess you never really know when.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit there, Anthony.
I guess when you hear somebody talking, I guess it's got to be their judgment on whether you're, authentic and genuine. And I've gotten, we all have people that are fans. We have people that are haters. But one thing I've always gotten was that I come across as authentic in the story. I'm not looking to make up a story. There's really nothing to make up. I'm not saying I actually downplay my story. There's a lot of people that have my story that would be going the other route. I'm trying to tell you I didn't want to kill my boss. Other guys would take that because it was written in the newspapers that I killed my boss for power and to control the area. And that was written for like 7 years. So, that would even make me look like what you said earlier with guys exaggerating the story. That would make me look more notorious on the streets if it did go that route. Wow, he took his boss over like a Gotti did the Castellano type move, but that wasn't the case in my case. But so when I tell the story like that, that's downplaying if anything, that's downplaying the role. I could have went with the story that was, reported for so many years and probably got like you said, people would want to exaggerate their stories and become more whatever. Yeah,
more. It could be any, right. Could be for any reason, right? It could be financial or ego or whatever else. Got it. No,
and if you listen, like anybody that knows the area here, like I couldn't get into so many stories in that book. It would, like I said, it would have been 5,000 pages. But like everybody that knows the story, especially guys that grew up with me here, they're like, everything is, there's not one thing that's not true that I come across saying.
How do you think you're going to be remembered within the organized crime community and by the public at large? Are you concerned about the legacy that you leave behind?
So what I'm looking to do now is a way to give back is I want to help. I want to make money, obviously, but I want to help. My whole thing in life, even when I made money illegally, I like to make money with people that I liked, bring them in on something, and we all share the profits and, go out and celebrate, have dinners, go on vacation. I like the camaraderie of making money with people that I surround myself with. And that's pretty much what I want to do now is I want to do the same thing with legitimate businesses and share the profits with people that are around me. Now, I don't have quantity like I used to. I have quality, though. So the people around me now, I have a lot of good personal friends that are, the quality is 100%. Whereas in that life before, the quantity was huge and the quantity was shit. you're only good is until you go to prison. And then when you go to prison, I don't care if you cooperate or not, they're looking to steal everything from you. And that's from guys that are murderous bosses, murderers, that they steal your money on the streets. They'll go after your girlfriends, and that's happening all over the, stories you hear about that. I don't want to even get into names about it, but it happens all over the same story. Yeah, they take your money. They go after your. Now you get out and you got to kill them. So it's a never-ending process.
Right.
It's like now you got to go out and kill them. So the legacy I want to leave is I want to become highly successful again in the legitimate world, and I want to give to my family. I want to give back. Because I was never home for my kids. I was in prison just about their whole life. From when they were born, and it's a way to help them give back, and I help people in general to make money. I'm also helping a lot of people. I learned a lot of stuff in jail, in prison, Frank, as far as going through, and not that I didn't deserve any, we all go through hard times, and, I was in prison, and, you go from being a king of a major mafia family in our area to losing everything just about. So you go through a suffering. Doesn't matter if I deserve it or not. Of course I deserve it, but you still go through it. So I've read so many self-help books, and so I got into so deep into philosophy that, not like we said in the last interview, not with the God and, I did, read the Bible, the Quran, just to get knowledge out of it. But I got into this philosophy. One of the guys' books was James Allen. And so I have most of my talks, like you see me go online and do interviews they want to talk about the mob shit. I did one interview where the kid asked me about all the stuff I'm telling you now about, transcending from my past, and not being that same guy that I was, learning about going inside myself, analyzing myself, self-analyzing, why did I do the stuff that I did? Was, we always deflect, and some, we're psychopaths. We always justify a reason for what we do, learning why I had that behavior, and people can say psychopaths all you want, but when a mafia guy's coming to kill you and he's a murderer, what are you going to do? Let him kill you, or are you going to kill him?
Right. I understand.
So they can say all their stories what they want, but I like talking. I get so many messages helping people that are going through life problems. You just message me on my Instagram, the Facebook Messenger, and talking to them about life's problems. And I get more out of that, helping people. And that's what I really like to do. I like talking about that stuff.
That's great.
But, with the mob stuff, it's like, what's an interview going to want to talk to me about?
Right.
They're going to want to talk about mob shit.
Yeah. No, yeah. I absolutely get it. And case in point of where...
And I'm not glorifying my life. Believe me, I'm not glorifying... Like, I'm always was a money guy. I like to make money. I like business. I like to... I reject so many interviews. Eric Sean reached out to me for you, and for the interview, and I'm doing it. But I reject so many interviews. Like I'm getting contacted like 3 interviews a week that I don't go on their interviews.
I believe it, and I appreciate you sitting.
And I'm not glorifying that life. I would, like I tell you, I wish I never got made. I would have told today there's nothing to make a kid today, so it's like worthless. No one's going to.
Well, let me end with that, Anthony, and I appreciate you as always being so generous with your time. You alluded to how the mafia has changed from when you first got involved to today. Based on your experience, where do you see the future of organized crime heading? Do you believe the mafia still holds anywhere near the same power and influence as it did during your time?
So everybody thinks that the mafia is dead, right? And it is. The old ways of doing things are dead. Just think about, again, with the rackets. You're not making the money with the sports gambling. The economy is so bad. You're not making money with loan sharking. People can't even pay their bills. The middle class is getting destroyed. You can't pay your bills. So loan sharking business is dead. All the casino gambling that we had is dead. They got casinos everywhere now. The Joker poker vending, they got casinos now. Why are they going to play your vending machine? They can go right down the street and play at the at the casino. We got an MGM in downtown Springfield. So the rackets on the street are dead. And so with that, and like I said, they're smart. They're not killing anybody today, which is going to make them last on the street. So the old timers that went through all of this and made it through, that are in their 70s, 80s, and got hundreds of millions of dollars. They're not going to issue a murder contract. So they want to stay on the streets and die on the streets and live the rest of their life. So what I think is going to happen is the mafia is going to transcend into a legitimate organization. They're still going to take shots with, and because they're not going to have they don't control the streets anymore like they did, so, the streets, you've got gangs now today, and it's mostly all drugs today. So, so I think it's going to transcend into a legitimate empire, which is what I wanted to do around here when I got out in '08, prior to me getting out of the life in 2010. If I made it through in '08, what my thing was, I was getting involved in all like the strip club industry, legitimate business, restaurants, the food industry, the garbage industry, all legitimate businesses, and make it. And then you create a sort of family where the punishment is, instead of killing them if they mess up, is they're banished from your network anymore. So now it would be like they can't make money around your circles, and they're blackballed. And that's a bigger punishment, because if you're in with all kinds of guys with a network with multi-millions of dollars, and they can open up doors in all kinds of businesses, and then they blackball you, and now that window's closed. Now it's hard for you to go out and make money. You're not part of that crew anymore, of that association. I think that's how the route they're going to go in the future.
Makes sense. Anthony, you've been very generous with your time. I'm going to end it there. I hope everyone checks out your book, End Syndicate, How I Took Over the Genovese Springfield Crew. Appreciate the time very much.
All right, Frank. Good talking to you. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Likewise. If you want to offer any feedback on our discussion, please email me. My email is frank.morano@wabcradio.com. That's frank.morano@wabcradio.com. If somebody sent you this podcast, or if you stumbled upon it on social media, do us a favor and pass it on to a friend. Please retweet, repost, reshare, and hopefully you will subscribe. Just search The Racket Report on any podcast app, and whenever we have a new episode, it'll automatically come to your phone or your wireless device. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.